here at Atmosera, based out of Chicago. I've been in the business for about a decade now. So just here to talk today about all things DevOps and GitHub and all that good stuff. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Thanks, Joe. So just a quick context for what this session is and who Atmosera is. High level Atmosera, we are a professional service and managed services and training firm, a consulting group that is really focused on all things Azure and DevOps, including GitHub. I sit on the GitHub Partner Advisory Board as well. So we get to hear a lot of the cool things that GitHub, as well as Microsoft in general, is really pushing for not only their strategy, but their go-to-market, what they're seeing from customers, all that good stuff. So a lot of today's talk is going to be focused on really what we're hearing in that ecosystem. A little bit of context will be shared around, some of the basics, what's DevOps and how is that started? And we're going to try and keep the 101 stuff pretty quick. In general, we want to have a dialogue here. So Joe and I are going to be grabbing a bunch of topics from a hat and talking through. It's going to be a really kind of natural conversation. There is not a script. Joe and I have a host of 20 questions or so, as well as some data from everyone that has signed up for this podcast, I'll call it, in terms of just what their overall experience with GitHub has been so far. Thank you to those who have answered some of the questions that we sent out there. Joe, anything else that you want to add before we jump in?
Really just off the cuff, yeah, I'm really excited to have this be more of a dialogue than a scripted presentation, because we want to be able to give you the real, what we've been dealing with and what we've been seeing. So I feel like it would do us a disservice if we just wrote up a script for you.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start out with kind of a really high level of like, where has the DevOps world come over the past decade? I'm going to try and set this expectation mainly as a foundation for where we go. Again, we don't have a script. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different topics, so let's jump into it. So DevOps as a whole, when you think about how software has changed the world, essentially in early 2010, 2008, 9, at the rise of cloud computing and the ability to grab resources and spin them up on the fly, it started allowing people to essentially bring infrastructure into this world of software development. So when it first started, it was, hey, we've got developers writing code, we've got this ops group that's running infrastructure. What if we put them together and is there going to be some benefit? So essentially, the development world took a number of those principles and brought it over to infrastructure. The word DevOps as a whole, right, has changed a lot over the past decade. It really began as how can we help our developers push out code faster, and has morphed into all of these different methodologies, right? There's a number of books that have been written. Everyone has their own different practices. We've seen a varying degree of customers in their DevOps implementations overall, whether that's working with large software ISVs or old stodgy manufacturing firms. We've kind of seen it all. The three kind of OG firms that I tend to look at when we think about who's doing DevOps really well, Toyota really coined a lot of the initial DevOps methodologies when they were evolving into Kanban methodologies and software development. Target did a really nice job with infrastructure automation back in the early, I want to say 2012, 13, 14 era. And then Netflix, once Netflix launched, that was obviously a disruptor in the blockbuster worlds, but the ability to spin up infrastructure and get applications out faster and safer, Netflix is really one of the primary examples of who's doing it really well. Now, in general, these organizations all have their challenges and all have their problems, and so we've been able to help a number of these organizations really advance their thinking and their topics. A couple of the things that we're seeing today, at least, is similar to some of the questions that we asked you guys when you signed up, right? What is this 0-day deployment thing? I saw a lot of unsures when people were responding to that, so that's definitely a topic we'll go into. Another one was 0-day deployment, right? Shifting left. All these topics are things that we can talk about and we'll get into. So let's start off with a couple of questions that Joe and I have put together. We're going to start pretty basic, and we're going to get into a lot of the GitHub frameworks of what we're seeing in today's world. So Joe, how about we start on question one? Like, what is a DevOps implementation? What does DevOps mean to you? How do you view the world?
Yeah, so when people hear DevOps implementation, the first thing that comes to mind is fear for first, because DevOps implementation, it means a lot. It's overarching. It touches a lot of the business. So what we're trying to do is try to break that down into easily digestible chunks. So the first thing I want to talk about is really the idea of like DevOps as an engineering practice. So typically in an organization, you'll see people titled or labeled as DevOps engineers. So for me, particularly, maybe going against the grain here a little bit, but I don't like the term DevOps engineer because that silos isn't it only an engineer can be part of the DevOps transformation or a DevOps implementation. I like the term a DevOps practitioner. And so I'm trying to evangelize that a little bit here, because a DevOps practitioner at the end of the day is just someone who embodies that DevOps mindset, because it's across the entire organization. Anybody who is working to collaborate efficiently across the organization and to break down silos and to make everyone's jobs easier by following process and procedure and automation controls is a DevOps practitioner. So it's not just an engineering thing. It's a product owner thing. It's a project management thing. It's all across the board, security. And that's where you're seeing evolutions in this, is we're getting away from the idea that we're just building another practice that sits in between softwares and operations. We don't want to do that. And working with a lot of clients and working with a lot of different partners over the years, is that's what we're trying to get away from, and that's what we see is that's the fear. Is you come in, DevOps implementation happens, and you just put some DevOps engineers in there, and they sit between the softwares and the developers. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to break down those walls, not add another set of barriers to it. So really, the DevOps practitioner mindset is that your software developers and your operational people are DevOps practitioners on top of what they do today. And originally, you may think, okay, well, that's just more work for these people to do, but it's really not. What it is it may be a bit to bite off at the beginning, but the idea is the automation and the controls that are put in place once you take that initial investment into it are going to drastically reduce your long tail effort in the future. And that's really all about what a DevOps implementation is about, is reducing workloads, manual workload processes, so that your engineers and your operations and anyone involved in the business can get their job done more efficiently and can focus on the tasks that matter. So at the end of the day, that's a DevOps implementation. It's people, processes, and toolings, but it's how do we orchestrate those together? So.
Joe, I've heard a lot of organizations talking about, and this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, but it's led to a lot of the behavior that we're seeing today. I've heard a lot of organizations have debates around, like, where does QA live in an organization, right? What type of organization is there a model where it should be under development? Is there a model where it should be kind of independent? What is your take on where QA should live?
To me, QA is inside of the entire process. It's not QA just sits at the very end of the line and then, okay, the developers produce code or application and then push it along the pipeline. And now we're in the point where it gets QA'd and it gets shuffled back into the system. I think there is a point in the process in which there should be a hard QA stop, and there should be a look for quality assurance to make sure that things are going as they should be. All the all the test pipelines and test controls are in place. But at the end of the day, those should be happening during the entire process. So it shouldn't be an afterthought. This whole idea of shifting left is shifting that iterative loop that we do as far left as possible. And to do that, we need to empower the developers to be able to have that control over that and be able to work directly with QA to build what they need. And so when it gets to QA, it's not a complete rebuild from the beginning. It's already been vetted all the way up to that point. So to answer your question, Charles, I really think it's unique to each organization, but I think every organization can benefit from making QA part of the process in the very beginning.
Well, that's interesting, because when I've been faced with the shift left conversation, it's mostly been around security. Is that kind of talk about shift left? Does that apply to security as well as QA? How are those two things different?
100%. So security and QA, I mean, they go hand in hand, and part of this is because quality can, making sure that you pass all the control checks. That's not just making sure that the security checks are in place, but it's making sure that those security checks that they do have in place align with the business standards of the business process that are set up. So security is part of it. You have that shift left mentality. It's about empowering the developers. At the end of the day, we want to automate as much of that process as possible in the DevOps implementation. So when we say shift left, we're just taking all the manual steps that were done farther down the chain in the classic mentality of it's built, we throw it over the wall. In the classic mentality, we're taking all that stuff that was built and manually thrown over the wall for QA and security to review, and just moving that into an automated work stream earlier on in the engagement. Because when we think about it, the earlier you can catch problems, the earlier you can squash bugs, the earlier that you can catch process control issues, not even talking about just engineering. So the earlier that you can catch, PM processes or product owner processes and controls, the earlier you can catch those vulnerabilities or you can catch those kinks in the system there, the less it's going to cost you in the long run. So it's a lot easier to fix something at its base than to disassemble and start from scratch. So that's really what the shift left mentality doing is. It's empowering people earlier on in the process to make those decisions and enact what they feel is needed for the business to move forward.
So are there tools out there from a shift left perspective? If I'm a VP, SVP of engineering or something like that, is the answer a tool? Is it the team? Is it behavior? Like how do I approach tackling some of these issues? Do I think about it in one certain lens or the other?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So that brings me on to a topic that I love is the whole idea of DevOps theater. So I've given talks before, I've given presentations before where we represent what DevOps is in its offering mindset. And it is absolutely insane the amount of tools that have flooded the ecosystem now that claim to be DevOps. And they might solve specific problems. They have certain use cases, and during that cyclical DevOps process, going from developing, processing, planning, all the way through monitoring and observability, there's hundreds of tools at each stage there. So what we're seeing now, though, is when we go into clients, we're actually seeing a contraction of tools, and that's where GitHub comes into play. Is we're seeing companies go, okay, well, we have a DevOps implementation right now, or we already have teams working in this style of environment, but they've got 18 different tools that they have to interface with in order to get the job done. So they're really looking for that single pane of glass. They're looking for that, okay, I log into this suite of tools and everything I need to do my job is right there. And that's where GitHub really comes into play. So you have your repository controls, your CI/CD controls, your project management, your advanced security. GitHub Advanced Security provides the toolings for shifting left in the security field. We also have co-pilot engagements like that to enable the developers to spend less time doing, menial, that 80% task, and they can focus on doing the 20%. So, that's really what we're seeing in the industry now is a contraction of tools where the cost has got out of hand and they have to really find something that answers more of their issues in the business than just, oh, we'll just get another product to do it. We'll just get another product to do it. And that's because that just gets really out of hand. So
outside of tool bloat, sounds like that's what you're discussing here.
Yeah.
What are some of the big pitfalls when you're thinking about DevOps in general? I'd love to get your take on GitHub as well, but just from a DevOps perspective, are there a couple things that are big giant red flags? Like when you're speaking with customers every day and they're saying, hey, we're doing this, we want to go do this GitHub or DevOps thing. When you hear XYZ, what are those XYZ things that you ping the rest of your team and say, oh God, this is going to be a crazy or nuts engagement, or I think they're taking a wrong approach on this. What are those things?
When I'm talking to a client, and when I hear we have to get approval from multiple teams to move forward on something, and they want to act in a DevOps mentality, that is a massive red flag for me. Because the whole point of DevOps is that there's automation in place, or there are processes in place so that there aren't 18 different approvals that have to go through a manual process and have to wait for reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a client that's already working in a so-called DevOps manner, and they're still enacting a ton of manual process, injecting it into the tools, to me, that's when I coined the phrase DevOps theaters. You have all the tools to work in a DevOps manner, but you're not actually implementing them in the proper way. They just end up being another tool set for you to use. So that's really that's a major red flag for me. Or when clients say that there's a lot of separation between their software and operations and security team, they're not interacting with one another, or there's friction between the teams. So those are things that you have to target first during an implementation, because culture is always the hardest thing to change. So those are one of the first things you need to make sure everybody's on board for that.
So when you're talking about culture, you know, it seems like the fun word of the day, I guess, in this decade, post 2020, right? Everyone's talking about how they have an awesome culture. You know, how does GitHub fit into this whole thing? I get that GitHub, cool. It's a place I can have my code. It's there's some tools to automate some things, and there's a security thing, and there's a bunch of AI tools with Copilot now that are launching. How does GitHub fit into this, not just from a tool perspective, but from a team behavior, team culture perspective? How does GitHub fit into all this?
Yeah, so I think part of it is really that at the very base level, you're all sailing on the same ship at that point. So you're not saying I'm a Jenkins administrator, or I'm a ADO administrator, I'm a GitHub administrator, I work in these tools. It's everyone sailing on the same ship. So it's likely you have a much easier time setting up visibility across your team's workloads in something like GitHub. So teams can have that insight into what's going on, maybe in a team they don't work with every day. So that creates that mentality of, hey, if I have that has to be promoted within the organization, but with something like GitHub, you can much more easily promote that and easily promote that insight and do that cross-team pollination of thoughts and ideas. So it creates that culture of, a business improvement as a whole, rather than this is my team, I'm just going to work in my team and by myself. So it really promotes teams to work across functionality.
Yeah, I see a lot of the customers that I speak with tend to have all these existing tool sets, right? Whether, Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, SVN, whatever it is, right? Whether they've gone through pain internally, or they've gone through an acquisition and have bought other companies that are using different things, ADO, whatnot. I see a lot of consolidation in folks saying, hey, I want to consolidate everything around Azure DevOps, ADO, and then eventually I'm going to move up to GitHub. Like, how do you approach that conversation? Is it great, let's just get you all on ADO and then that move to GitHub is easier? Is it, well, let's understand all these different teams first and understand if they can go straight to GitHub? What does that model look like when you've seen it?
Yeah, so working with larger organizations, it's a lot of understanding. A lot of larger organizations will break things apart into business units. And a lot of times what we're seeing is these business units are functioning almost as independent companies within the company itself. So what we need to understand is, what are the unique needs and necessary constraints that business unit has for migrating or moving to whatever platform they're planning on landing at. So each individual team might have different compliancy concerns, different security concerns, different automation requirements. So it's a matter of, okay, well, we've talked to XYZ team here. We need to find the least common denominator. We need to find a way to meld and make it so that there's an overarching policy that we can apply to the entire organization. So it's a difficult task, but it's something that sets you up for a much, much easier time in the future. And it's part of that, when I was talking about earlier, it's part of that initial bite off, that investment bite off when you're doing a DevOps implementation. We often see there's some growing pains in the very beginning, but they quickly trail off as people adopt that DevOps mindset. So really, it's just all about understanding each one of those business units, understanding the business as closely as we can, and then applying that to each individual team, as well as having a base foundation for them to stand on and be successful.
Let's say we're talking to some old school manufacturing group or someone that makes a really pretty standard product, right? I make widgets, right? And I've got this front end set of applications or back end set of applications that my teams use, and the more widgets I sell, the more profit I make. Like, what would I lose as a fairly simple organization if I don't do DevOpsy things? Like, why do I need this, right? If I'm just selling products, like, how does this help?
Well, I mean, baseline, it helps be competitive in the market. I mean, when you talked about Toyota, Netflix, Target early on, think about them now. They're leading their sectors, you know? So it's really comes down to the idea that being being flexible, having that team talent or whatnot, and getting your time to market be much faster. We need to iterate quicker. We talked about those 0 days. So it's okay, a smaller team may have, you're doing something on the day-to-day. It's very standard practice at this point, but what if we could iterate quicker? What if we could get those releases out faster? What are our competitors doing? And so if we rest on our laurels here and we say, okay, well, we have a tried and true process or whatnot, what you're really losing out on is opportunity to grow your strengths and pushing out faster and developing and growing quicker. And then if you also have these DevOps tool sets in place, you have these DevOps automation process in place, which makes your employees' life easier so they can do the creative, the engineers can do the creative work that they want to do instead of bogged down in manual processes. Employee retention is going to be higher. So you're going to have less burnout as well. Because at the end of the day, an engineer wants to code. They don't want to sit there and do manual reviews and all that stuff. They want to create and they want to provide value to their team, their business. So that's really a big part of it.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that. An engineer wants to engineer.
Exactly.
Mentality in the market. I mean, especially when you think about large scale enterprises. You go look at an engineering floor, half the computers are all talking about, they're in ServiceNow, they're in Excel, they're in PowerPoint, waiting for their next Scrum meeting, and they're not actually coding, right? So that kind of gets to the 0 day deployment stuff. Tell me more, like when you hear 0 day deployment, like what does it actually mean in practice? I understand it as if I hire some new talent, new engineer or developer, they can have the ability to deploy a line of code to production the first day they start. What does 0 day deployment mean to you? How does an organization actually get there?
Yeah, so 0 day deployment to me is exactly what you said. It's, Facebook has this mentality as well, where there are several pushes of production daily. And those pushes of production, they don't do massive releases like you used to do 10, 15 years ago, where you had to release every year or whatnot like that. Releases are happening daily. So getting there is the process. So how do you get there? Well, you have to have rock solid testing, automation, QA. There has to be a good process around automating pull, build, you name it. The whole system needs to be automated in order to get to that spot. Because if you are doing 0 day, you're committing to have an automated structure around your build and release cycles, your whole SDLC there. And ideally, that's where a very mature DevOps organization would be. That's the end state, is to be able to iterate and build and react to the market as quickly as possible. Because at the end of the day, it's released to market. So we want to make sure that we're releasing quality, application, quality product to market as quickly as possible to keep up with competition. I mean, that's what it is.
So let's pivot to GitHub a little bit. When you look at how GitHub has grown up, we'll call it, through the Microsoft acquisition to today, reflect on that. I'd love to just get your feedback. Like, how was the world talking about GitHub 8 years ago, 4 years ago, today? What does tomorrow look like? What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, GitHub has always, pretty much my career, GitHub has always been there. It's been for a while was the open source baby, and I think it still is, where everybody that is messing around and tinkering in GitHub, or say tinkering with code, doing personal projects, I mean, GitHub is the go-to place to store it. I mean, everything I've worked on that is open source or pet projects or everything, that's really where it started. Grassroots. It was just some place to collaborate, code, and build and be creative in the engineering space. And I think it's grown to the point now where it's kind of the de facto standard in the industry at this point. I mean, that's why you go to most repositories, build sessions, et cetera, they're using GitHub at some point. So, it's accelerated to the point now where it's an enterprise platform as well. It's not just those grassroots, garage kind of style companies that are coming up. It's an enterprise level engagement at this point. So, it can go out to teams of, 500,000, 10,000 people, and you can get organizations set up and using the tool. So to say it's grown a lot is an understatement. It's gone from something that you use for open source projects to something that you use to build your main application for your entire business. So it's come a long way, that's for sure.
Definitely, yeah. I was in their office 2 weeks ago in San Francisco in their headquarters. They've got this awesome 20-foot by 10-foot wall where they have this like Terminator style transparent globe that just rotates slowly, and they've got this thing that's it's showing all pull requests around the planet. And so they had a running daily ticker, and I think when I saw it, it was like 88,000.
Yeah, it's insane.
It was totally cool, and it almost looked like an asteroid hit each of the locations around the globe every time there's a pull request. So it's just this really, really cool thing. That's awesome, man. So how do you think the Microsoft acquisition has impacted GitHub, or if at all, right? I've seen it from the sales side, right? Knowing all the sellers at GitHub, they're moving from a much more transactional to more solution and challenger selling methodology, where they're really getting into it with customers now in a positive way versus just slinging licenses before. How have you seen that be impacted?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously at the beginning there was first fear when Microsoft acquired them, but I think that is assuaded by at this point, because there's a lot of backing behind it. There's backing behind it for it to grow, into the enterprise application that it is and that is today at this point. So I mean, it's the future of Microsoft is putting all their cards behind it. So I don't think we have a exact answer on how far out that is, but in foreseeable future for me, a DevOps professional, the GitHub is the de facto tool that's gonna be the one going into the future here. As for how do I see that in the businesses? Adoption. They see it. Microsoft, the acquisition happened, and everyone wants to get on board with that because that's where the development's going to be. That's where the improvements, that's where the next gen stuff is going to be. So it's all on board on GitHub right now. And as we see competitors, we're seeing people migrate over to GitHub, and they're seeing great return on it as well. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is the developers already have experience working in GitHub. A lot of engineers, like I said before, pet projects and stuff like that, they store that stuff in a GitHub repository. So it's familiar to them. There's a lot of easy buy-in there because it's like, hey, we want to move to GitHub. Okay, I've already been using the open source version of the free version of it, so this totally makes sense to me. So it's a lot easier of a transition than going to another private software type or private tooling.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing the world kind of lean into to all things GitHub right now. Almost every single customer that 8 years ago was saying, how do I get to Azure? How do I get to Azure? They're all talking, how do I get to GitHub now? I'm definitely seeing that from the sales side and just kind of what that front end funnel looks like. So when we see things like a ton of interest in a particular area, such as Copilot, right? Copilot seems to be the shiny object right now. What have you seen successful customers do from a Copilot perspective so far? I've seen a host of things I'd love to share, but I want your perspective first.
Yeah, I think the first thing is when you bring AI into the picture, everyone throws their hands up first. It's this idea like, oh no, it's the big scary thing in the room. AI is going to take over, so on and so forth, yada yada. But it's not the case. I mean, that's the first thing that I see successful businesses do is to really talk about what it's going to, how it's going to improve your life as an employee, how it's going to improve your coding, etc. And really, at the end of the day, Copilot's there to be an assistant. It's there to augment. So it's meant to make you enable more. Um, so, oh, I think we had a question there. But yeah, so for Copilot, it's really about how you can use it more effectively. How can you be a more effective developer with it as it augments you? You know, like it gets you to that 80%, and then you got to do that last 20%. And really, that last 20% or the design and architectural, that's where you want to be. That's where you're spending a lot of your time is the hard questions, where Copilot can come in and do a lot of the easier work for you. So you can focus on the complicated questions, the really hard hitting questions that you want to be as an engineer in my engineering days, you want to be trying to solve those complicated problems. So Copilot's really to assist you to get you there. So to me, the first successful thing that I've seen clients do is really explain how Copilot's going to help you. So and really wipe away that fear of AI in general. So
Yeah, great context, man. We'll come back to Copilot in a second. We got a question from Jeff. How's a startup transition from basically a small product into an enterprise model within GitHub? What challenges and growth, and how can a team of just a few developers, what can they do to prepare for that growth? So I guess part of it is there a difference between like a small footprint in GitHub and a major enterprise footprint in GitHub? And for those small organizations, like how do they get ready?
yeah, so that's really the beauty in it, is that a small organization in GitHub looks relatively similar to a large enterprise, just scaled out and duplicated, to infinitum as how far as you need to take it. Because the whole idea and the process we go through when we work with clients is we really set up that initial framework, set up the enterprise, put the policy controls in place. And really, after that, it's about duplicating that framework we've built from organization, which would be a lot of times we see one-to-one to a business unit inside the org. We just duplicate that across. And what's beautiful about that is that once you have this refined framework, this refined structure, it becomes very easy then to iterate that across all the rest of the business units. Now, obviously, you do run into edge cases and you run into idioms where they have unique controls or customizations they need in their business. But for the most part, that centralized framework we build is pretty bog standard at that point for the company. And then you can move that across and kind of shift that across throughout the org like a wave moving through. So, how would you start up a transition from small product to enterprise? Really just focus on refining and nailing down those processes and controls around that initial organization. So you want to just have that initial organization, the initial champion team, so to speak, be prim proper, everything's golden for them. And then you can just educate teams. And once teams are educated and onboarded into GitHub, you do some light touch points at that point, depending on their uptake. And then they're free to go. They're free to move about the campus, so to speak. So that's typically what we see is once you get that framework in place, it's very easy to then propagate that throughout the rest of the organization. That's a transition from a startup to enterprise, and that's going from an enterprise onboarding into GitHub. And that needs to then, develop this across 10,000 developers. So,
well, and that propagation question is something that comes up really, really common, especially now that we're seeing Copilot, because we've seen everyone just click the button, turn it on for like 5,000 developers, and then come back and say, oh, wait a minute, we need governance and security around this thing, and how does it fit into the overall SDLC? So, I mean, what does propagation mean to you? Is it, let me record a 1-hour session on GitHub and say, you're trained, go? Like, how do you build, back to that culture thing, how do you build culture while you propagate?
Yeah, so it's really about empowering when we talk about culture, what that means a ton of things. It's a very broad stroke. But what we really want to do is to me is we want to empower the developers so they can say, hey, I know how to use this tool. This tool helps me a lot. I can then talk to internally with my teams and get them using it too. If I have gotten someone to the point that they're excited to use the tool and the gears are turning in their head of where they can utilize this tool further on in their day-to-day or within their teams, and then utilize other GitHub, other toolings in the suite, you know, that's job well done for me, because I want people to do that. I don't want to get to the point where, and I don't think any DevOps professional wants to have the point where, because we go back to that DevOps mindset as a DevOps practitioner, you don't want to get to the point where it's just, okay, the DevOps person will handle it. That's not where we want to be. We want to be, okay, well, now I understand the DevOps mindset. I can go and do this work on my own, or I can take these practices that I've learned. And in regards to that, how do we get to that point? It could be a matter of, like you said, one-on-one sessions with people. It could be hands-on keyboard. It could be white glove. It could be self-serve. We develop self-serve tooling. So a lot of times when you go into clients, there is a way we develop this framework where there's a self-serve, an intermediate, and a white glove when we're talking about any of these styles of engagements, where self-serve is very much we provide the documentation, we build the infrastructure tooling for either a migration or gas or Copilot, and then they can kind of play on their own. These are typically individuals that are already versed in the tooling or already have a good understanding. And then intermediate might be people that are a little iffy on the tooling, so to speak, or they just need some extra guidance or best practices around it. That's where we can come in and do kind of over the shoulder peer programming or things of that nature with them. And then you have the white glove, where it's just either they're not involved in that or they do not have the time, and then we can go in and we can manage that for them, provide all the KT and documentation after the fact. And then obviously if we do white glove, we still want to make sure they're in a good place. There might be a checkpoint at some point after that. So that's really what we're seeing.
That's great, Joe. Let's shift over to security. We've got another question around shift left, right? How does this work with security in the GitHub ecosystem? What other options are there other than GitHub Advanced Security or GAS, right? Is it good? Does it work? How do I incorporate it? What's this GASDO thing that everyone's talking about with GitHub Advanced Security and Azure DevOps? How do you connect shift left with GitHub Advanced Security?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking about shifting left specifically for security, I mean, GitHub Advanced Security is your bread and butter at that point, because what it's doing actually is it's going into your code bases and it's doing secret scanning, it's doing vulnerability scanning, as well as giving you a reporting structure that somebody that is a product owner or part of the PM can look at and then report on to whoever needs it. And aggregate that information on what needs to be high target or high task to repair. So when we're talking about shift left, you're taking all of those tools and you're saying, okay, the developers, you need to understand how to use this, and we'll train you on how to use this, and you need to have security at a mindset right from the get-go. So with GitHub and the GAS tooling, that's really what it's doing, is it's providing the tool set that's going to automatically go into a developer's code before they commit it, before they do any sort of PR to main, before any security individual looks at it. It's going to say, hey, you've got a vulnerability or there's a secret here. Here's a suggestion how you might fix it. So before it even gets to the security team, all these ones and twosies might also be taken care of by the developers. Now, obviously, there could be security concerns that the security team might want to look at, but that reduces it so they can focus on the big vulnerabilities that are in place. Mm-hmm. And then when we talk about GAS, though, it's pretty much just it's pretty simple. It's just taking GAS and implementing it in Azure repositories, Azure DevOps repositories. So there's an integration chain there. So it's doing all the same things that GitHub Advanced Security would do in GitHub, but it's doing Azure DevOps with Azure.
So that breeds the dirty question that I'm going to ask. What the heck is the difference between Azure DevOps and GitHub these days? Is there a difference? Can I've heard project management come up from a Azure DevOps versus GitHub perspective. Like, yeah. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I mean, personally, professionally, so it's GitHub is the future. GitHub is where Microsoft is going. I mean, there's no denying that. But Azure DevOps is still a very mature tool that's used in tons of organizations today, and it can do everything. It can do Azure pipelines, can is equivalent to Azure GitHub workflows and GitHub Actions. Azure repositories is equivalent to just the GitHub repositories. And Azure boards, I think what you were mentioning there, I think Azure boards may be a little bit more mature right now, but that's all in the work. That's all in the roadmap pipeline for GitHub. So there are use cases for both tools. I think both tools are fantastic, but in my opinion, if you were starting fresh and you had no prior requirements, if and or buts about them, I would go with GitHub personally. Now, if you already had an Azure DevOps implementation, or that is the talent pool that you have to work with, your engineers know Azure DevOps, go with Azure DevOps, because there is backwards compatibility coming from GitHub to Azure DevOps. So I think both tools are fantastic. It's just, what is your talent? What is your talent like in your organization? And are we starting fresh, or are we starting with a, kind of a brownfield deployment here where there's something existing already?
Yeah, I mean, talent is definitely top of mind for what I hear my customers talking about. A lot of it is, I want to be the sexy workplace where people say, I want to be a destination employer, right? And what I'm hearing from them is, if I don't do these things, right? If I'm not cloud, if I'm not DevOps, whatever that means to them, if I'm not GitHub, then I don't get to hire as many people as I want, and more people don't accept the offer I give them. Definitely seeing that. That gets to a lot of the cultural elements. Absolutely. When you think about like just the overall relationship with Microsoft, I've seen a lot of customers struggle with the question, like, am I going to be AWS? Am I going to be Azure, GCP, all over the place? But I'm definitely going to be GitHub. What do you think from an engineering perspective? And I've got my thoughts from a commercial perspective. From an engineering perspective, like, what does it mean to have a Microsoft relationship starting from a GitHub world, right?
Okay, so if you're having a Microsoft relationship from a GitHub world, I mean, for one, you're going to get the support. I mean, that's big. So you're going to get that support from Microsoft immediately, whether that be technical support or physical support, whatever it might be. There's going to be some levels of support there that you have access to by being Microsoft customer in Azure and in GitHub. So, and also there's going to be integrations, and it's going to be an easier line of there's just going to be an easier line of communication there with that partner ecosystem. And then when you think about it, since Microsoft is heavily, heavily behind GitHub, where do you, as an engineer, just speaking blank, where do you think all the integration, all the time for building new tooling is going to go to? It's going to go to working with Azure and working with GitHub. So it just makes sense at that point, if you're going to be working in GitHub, to be working in Azure as well. So
yeah, one of the biggest call outs that I hear, and this is definitely something to remember if anyone on the line is struggling with GitHub, trying to get there, everything, wherever you are in your stage in your journey, GitHub is the hot thing for Microsoft right now, and so they're dropping a lot of funding programs to work with organizations like ourselves and have us come in and work with teams. The funding element is definitely a big piece of that. Depending on the type of customer that we're talking to, everyone gets different amounts. But from a partner ecosystem perspective, there is definitely always support. And that's what I hear most from customers saying, I've either got an awesome Microsoft relationship and they help me out in all these ways, or I'm just starting that Microsoft relationship because GitHub is my first foray. So definitely seeing a lot of that. Joe, just using the last couple of minutes here, because geez, 45 minutes went really, really fast.
Yeah.
For me, it did. When you think about just how to champion DevOps in an organization, whether it's GitHub or not, right? What does that conversation look like, bringing that to leadership? Is there any guidance that you can give to anyone that says, hey, here's how we want to start looking at this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's going to be very unique to every business, but some baseline guidelines I can think right off the top of my head are, For one, when you're talking to that at a business level, it's really, okay, how fast are we moving currently? How fast are we iterating through the SDLC currently? And then the question after that is, how fast can we go if we had all automation in place? If we had automation in place and we had everyone on board and the teams in a perfect world, how fast could we go? And then the question becomes, okay, once you figure that out, the question becomes, what do we need to get there? And that's where the conversation starts of, okay, you start identifying the pain points and you say, okay, well, the first thing we need to talk about is a process around developer using our repositories or something. And you can get kind of into the nitty gritty right there. So when you're having that conversation of, okay, why would I implement, or how do I even go about starting this process? It's a very introspective conversation that needs to be had with the business. It really needs to maybe rip off the Band-Aid and talk about things that don't want to be talked about, or talk about processes and say, hey, we haven't changed this in 10 years, but at the end of the day, we really need to look at it, because where are our bottlenecks? Because ideally, the de facto kind of golden standard in DevOps is that if you are not putting effort to unblocking a bottleneck, it is wasted effort. So if you're putting effort to some place that is not uncorking a bottleneck, that's wasted effort, because it doesn't matter how fast you go at the C stage, if at the B stage always takes 3 days. So you're always going to be limited by that. So you really want to hone in on what those limiting factors are, and that would be the key place to start. And then once you release those, you can start fleshing out and looking at more maturity in the process.
Awesome. I love it, man. Like every time we have one of these chats, I learn more from you, and I hope everyone also got something out of this conversation. Joe and I are going to start doing these talks more frequently. So if you've got folks that are on your teams, or if you just want to participate, I'm going to try and figure out a way to make this so that everyone can chime in and speak up as well as just the chat windows. Joe and I are going to stay on here for the last 8 minutes, answering any questions that you may have. Please feel free to ask. I also put my contact info in that chat window. We're here for you. We want to make sure that you guys get a lot out of this as well. It's fun for Joe and I just to talk about these topics, but definitely want that engagement. And there's no such thing as a bad question. A lot of these things are new to me, even though I've been in this ecosystem for over a decade now. So thank you, everyone. If you'd like to stay on and ask some questions, we're here for you. Got some good questions. Perfect. I was getting pinged by a couple of folks on Teams in the background, Joe. Mike, I see you got a raised hand here. I'm gonna see if I can try and unmute you or something like that. We'll see if it works.
No, I think he's self-muted there.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex topic, and you could go days talking about this, or it's a rabbit hole for sure, and it's everyone needs help navigating it, because it touches so many parts of the business.
I've been seeing a ton of shiny object syndrome on GitHub Copilot lately. Most organizations have started with, hey, I need to prove ROI and efficiency and give me metrics and dashboards. And then you go to them and say, hey, by the way, that's like 4 to 6 weeks and close to 100 grand if you want to build that out properly. And everyone just jumps right back to, well, we need adoption. So let's start there. So I've kind of heard 3 things, right? I want to prove ROI, or I want to drive adoption, or I want to protect myself against the AI getting into hallucinations and thinking random things. So most organizations, I mean, in general, I'd say grab a couple Copilot trainings, find the right types of recommendations that your organization is going to really latch onto and use, and focus on the behavior of how people are actually using that and integrating that. And once you've got 2 months or 5 or 6 releases or something like that, full releases of data, look back at how your team's happiness is. And if they feel more empowered and they can run faster because of it, great. Do you really need all those dashboards to prove ROI? Maybe. And if you do at that point, you've got data from before and you've got data from just going through the exercise. So that seems to be the best path for most organizations right now. We've seen this from teams of 25, I think is the smallest, to we had a team of 10,000 developers that's currently launching Copilot. So the experience is quite similar across the board, irrespective of size. I think that's one of the most interesting things that I've seen.
Exactly. I think I see Mike is green on the mic if you've got a question.
Hi guys, yeah, sorry there. Yeah, Joe, so can you talk, not all customers start off as, Git or GitHub customers. They may be coming from a different platform. Can you talk about what it's like for those folks, and if there's, anything that they should be concerned about, or what it's like to just migrate to GitHub?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of customers we talk to, I see a mass migration off of Bitbucket right now. That seems to be where everyone's fleeing at the moment. So, coming off of another ecosystem, the first thing you really have to ask, or you really have to understand, is how is this impacting the business? How long is this going to take for migration? And in order to do that, we need to have a really good understanding of the size of their current environment. How many users do they have? It's very basic things that we need to understand in order to scope something like that. And then the second thing is, do my developers already know how to use GitHub? Is there the knowledge and expertise there to maintain this once we're gone, in order to bring people in and make sure they're ready to use it? So that's where training's coming. So there really has to be a lot of introspection there, like I was talking about before, about, okay, well, we want to go, we've got the backing to do it, but we need to make sure we make the leap properly so we don't trip halfway through, because there's a lot of frustration we see with clients where they'll say, oh, we tried this on our own and it's failed halfway through, and now we're sitting in GitHub and we're sitting in Bitbucket and we got half and half everything. And so that framework that I was talking about before, that's part of it. That's why we try to take a small chunk. Once we figure out what they currently have, we then take a small team and we say, okay, we're going to get you guys to be the gold standard SMEs in GitHub. And then once we got that framework built, we can then go, okay, now we need to grab the rest of you and pull you over. So that's really what I see is a lot of teams, a lot of companies, they'll just pull the trigger, say, okay, everyone's going to GitHub, or everyone's getting off the system, or removing Jenkins, or going to Actions or whatnot. And then they're just left to their own devices to do it as they please. And we know how that works. Priorities come up, timelines crunch, etc. Things get moved back. Why would I migrate this if it's working now here? They don't understand the licensing terms and the contract renewal kind of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. At the end of the day, the developer is just worried about their build is building on their current system. Why would I complicate this and move it over to the new system? But there are commercial sides of the business that require that. So we just need to make sure there's an understanding there, and we need to make sure that we get these teams over as fluidly and as easily as possible. So that's where that framework comes in. Does that kind of answer your question?
That's awesome. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. So another side question here is the GitHub project management tools. Are they worth exploring? So the project management tools in GitHub, they're very good for engineering. So I think the project boards, et cetera, they're built by engineers for engineers. So they're really good in the engineering side of the field. I think there's some augmentation that would need to happen outside of that. But for doing like Kanban sprints, things of that nature, typical development lifecycle practices that a project manager would oversee, I think the project boards are more than capable of doing that. So see if we get any more questions coming in. I'm more than happy to have you guys pick my brain.
I think we're good, man.
Okay.
1 hour talk down. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Again, would love feedback on this session, whether it be style, topics, whatnot. We can go super deep as well. This was really high level, kind of a what the heck is this DevOps stuff? What's the industry look like these days? And a focus on GitHub. So If you guys are interested in having further discussions, please let us know. Otherwise, thank you again for the time. You guys have an awesome rest of the day and a good weekend. Cheers.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.